Chapter 4. There is no fiction. The distinctions between what is real and what is imaginary is not one that can be finally maintained. All existing things are, in an intelligible sense, imaginary. John S. Mackenzie. There is no fiction. If an imaginal activity can produce a physical effect, our physical world must be essentially imaginal. To prove this would require merely that we observe our imaginal activities and watch to see whether or not they produce corresponding external effects. If they do, then we must conclude that there is no fiction. Today's imaginal drama, fiction, becomes tomorrow's fact. If we had this wider view of causation, that causation is mental, not physical, that our mental states are causative of physical effects, then we would realize our responsibility as a creator and imagine only the best imaginable. Fable enacted as a sort of stage play in the mind of what causes the physical facts of life. Man believes that reality resides in the solid objects he sees around him, that it is in this world the drama of life originates, that events spring suddenly into existence, created moment by moment out of antecedent physical facts. But causation does not lie in the external world of facts. The drama of life originates in the imagination of man. The real act of becoming takes place within man's imagination and not without. The following stories could define causation as the assemblage of mental states, which occurring creates that which the assemblage implies. The foreword from Walter Lord's A Night to Remember illustrates my claim. Imagining creates reality. In 1898, a struggling author named Morgan Robertson concocted a novel about a fabulous Atlantic liner, far larger than any then that had ever been built. Robertson loaded his ship with rich and complacent people, and then wrecked it one cold April night on an iceberg. This somehow showed the futility of everything, and in fact, the book was called Futility when it appeared that year, published by the firm of M.F. Mansfield. 14 years later, a British shipping company, named the White Star Line, built a steamer remarkably like the one in Robertson's novel. The new liner was 66,000 tons displacement. Robertson's was 70,000 tons. The real ship was 882 feet long. The fictional one was 880 feet. Both could carry about 3,000 people, and both had enough lifeboats for only a fraction of this number. But then this didn't seem to matter because both were labeled unshakable. On April 19, 1912, the real ship left Southampton on her maiden voyage to New York. Her cargo included a priceless copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and a list of passengers collectively worth $250 million. On her way over, she too struck an iceberg and went down on a cold April night. Robertson called his ship the Titan. The White Star crews called it the Titanic. Had Morgan Robertson known that imagining creates reality, that today's fiction is tomorrow's fact, would he have written the novel Futility? In the moment of the tragic catastrophe, writes Schopenhauer, the conviction becomes more distinct to us than ever that life is a bad dream from which we have to awake. And the bad dream is caused by the imaginal activity of sleeping humanity. Imaginal activities may be remote from their manifestations, and unobserved events are only appearance. Causation is seen in this tragedy as elsewhere in space-time. Far off from the scene of action, invisible to all, was Robertson's imaginal activity, like a scientist in a control room, directing his guided missile through space-time. Who paints a picture, writes a play or book, which others read while he's asleep in bed. Oh, the other side of the world, when they're overlooked. His page the sleeper might as well be dead. What knows he of his distant unfelt life? What knows he of the thoughts his thoughts are raising, the life his life is giving, or the strife? Concerning him, some cavilling, some praising. Yet which is most alive, he who is asleep, or his quick spirit in some other place, or a score of other places that doth keep attention fixed and sleep from others chase? Which is the he that sleeps, or he that his own he can neither feel nor see? Samuel Butler. Imaginative writers communicate not their vision of the world, but their attitudes which result in their vision. Just a short while before Catherine Mansfield died, she said to her friend Orage, "There are in life as many aspects as attitudes toward it, and aspects change with attitudes. Could we change our attitude, we should not only see life differently, but life itself would come to be different. Life would undergo a change of appearance, because we ourselves have undergone a change in attitude. Perception of a new pattern is what I call a creative attitude towards life." Prophets, wrote Blake, in the modern sense of the word, have never existed. Jonah was no prophet in the modern sense, for his prophecy of Nineveh failed. Every honest man is a prophet. He utters his opinion both of private and public matters. Thus, if you go on so, the result is so. He never says, such a thing shall happen, let you do what you will. A prophet is a seer, not an arbitrary dictator. The function of the prophet is not to tell us what is inevitable, but to tell us what can be built up out of persistent, imaginal activities. The future is determined by the imaginal activities of humanity, activities in their creative march, activities which can be seen in your dreams and the visions of your head as you lay in bed. Would that all the Lord's people were prophets, in the true sense of the word, like this dancer who now, from the summit of his realized ideal, sights yet higher peaks that are to be scaled. After you have read this story, you will understand why he is so confident that he can predetermine any materialistic future he desires, and why he is equally sure that others give reality to that what we otherwise a mere figment of his imagination, that there exists and can exist nothing outside of imagining on some level or another. Nothing continues in being save what imagining supports. The mind can make substance and people planets of its own with beings brighter than have ever been, and give a breath to form which can outlive all flesh. As my story begins at the age of 19, I was a mildly successful dancing teacher, and continued in this static state for almost 5 years. At the end of this time, I met a young lady who talked me into attending your lecture. My thought upon hearing you say, imagining creates reality, was that the entire idea was ridiculous. However, I decided to accept your challenge and disprove your thesis. I bought your book, Out of This World, and read it many times. Still unconvinced, I set myself a rather ambitious goal. My present position was an instructor with the Arthur Murray Dance Studio, and my goal was to own a franchise and be boss of an Arthur Murray studio myself. This seemed the most unlikely thing in the world, as franchises were extremely difficult to secure. But on top of this fact, I was completely without the necessary funds to begin such an operation. Nevertheless, I assumed the feeling of my wish fulfilled, as night after night, in my imagination, I went to sleep managing my own studio. 3 weeks later, a friend called me from Reno, Nevada. He had the Murray studio there, and said it was too much for him to cope with alone. He offered me a partnership, and I was delighted, so delighted in fact, that I hastened to Reno on borrowed money, and promptly forgot all about you and your story of imagination. My partner and I worked hard and were very successful, but after a year I was still not satisfied. I wanted more. I began thinking of ways and means to get another studio. All of my efforts failed. One night as I retired, I was restless and decided to read. As I looked through my collection of books, I noticed your slender volume, Out of This World. I thought of all the silly nonsense I had gone through 1 year ago before getting my own studio. Getting my own studio. The words in my mind electrified me. I reread the book that night, and later, in my imagination, I heard my superior praise the good job we had done in Reno and suggest we acquire a second studio, as he had a second location ready for us if we desired to expand. I reenacted this imaginal scene nightly without fail. 3 weeks from the first night of my imaginal drama, it materialized, almost word for word. My partner accepted the new studio in Bakersfield, and I had the Reno studio loan. Now I was convinced of the truth of your teaching, and never again will I forget. Now I wanted to share this wonderful knowledge of imaginal power with my staff. I tried to tell them of the marvels they could accomplish, but I was unable to reach many, although one fantastic incident resulted from my efforts to tell this story. A young teacher told me he believed my story, but said it would have probably happened anyway in time. He insisted the entire theory was nonsense, but stated that if I could tell him something of an incredible nature that would actually happen, and which he could witness, then he would believe. I accepted his challenge and conceived a truly fantastic test. The Reno studio is the most insignificant in the entire Murray system because of the small population count in the city itself. There are over 300 Murray studios in the country, with much larger populations, therefore providing greater possibilities to draw from. So my test was this. I told the teacher that within the next 3 months, at the time of a national dance convention, the little Reno studio would be the foremost topic of conversation at that convention. He calmly stated this was quite impossible. That night when I retired, I felt myself standing before a tremendous audience. I was speaking on creative imaging, and felt the nervousness of being before such a vast audience. But I also felt the wonderful sensation of audience acceptance. I heard the roar of applause, and as I left the stage, I saw Mr. Murray himself come forward and shake my hand. I reenacted this entire drama night after night. It began to take on the tones of reality, and I knew I had done it again. My imaginal drama materialized down to the last detail. My little Reno studio was the talk of the convention, and I did appear on that stage just as I had done in my imagination. But even after this unbelievable but actual happening, the young teacher who threw me the challenge remained unconvinced. He said it had all happened too naturally, and he was sure it would have happened anyway. I did not mind his attitude because his challenge had given me another opportunity to prove at least to myself that imaging does create reality. From that time on, I continued with my ambition to own the largest Arthur Murray dance studio in the world. Night after night in my imagination, I heard myself accepting a studio franchise for a great city. Within 3 weeks, Mr. Murray called me and offered me a studio in a city of 1.5 million people. It is now my goal to make my studio the greatest and biggest in the entire system, and of course, I know it will be done through my imagination. Imagining, writes Douglas Fawcett, may be hard to grasp. Being quicksilver-like, it vanishes into each of its metamorphoses and thereby displays its transformative magic. We must look beyond the physical fact for the imagining which has caused it. For 1 year, E.O.L. Jr. lost himself in his metamorphosis, but fortunately he remembered the silly nonsense he had gone through before getting his own studio, and he reread the book. Imaginal acts on the human level need a certain interval of time to develop, but imaginal acts, whether committed to print or locked in the bottom of a hermit, will realize themselves in time. Test yourself. If only out of curiosity you will discover the profit is your own imagining, and you will know there is no fiction. We should never be certain that it is not some woman treading in the winepress who began the subtle changes in men's mind, or that the passion, because of which so many countries were given to the sword, did not begin in the mind of some shepherd boy, lighting up his eyes for a moment before it ran upon its way. William Butler Yeats. There is no fiction. Imagining fulfills itself in what our lives become, and now I have told you before it takes place, so that when it does take place you may believe. The Greeks were right. The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men, but they have fallen asleep and do not realize the might they wield by their imaginal activities. Real are the dreams of gods and smoothly pass, their pleasure in a long immortal dream. E.B., an author, is fully aware that today's fiction can become tomorrow's fact. In this letter she writes, "One spring I completed a novelette, sold it and forgot it. Not until many long months later did I sit down and nervously compare some facts in my fiction with some facts in my life. Please read a brief outline of my created story, then compare it with my personal experience. The heroine of my story took a vacation trip to Vermont, to the small city of Stowe, Vermont, to be exact. When she reached her destination, she was faced with such unpleasant behavior on the part of her companion that she either had to continue her lifetime pattern of allowing another selfish demand dominate her, or to break that pattern and leave. She broke it and returned to New York. When she returned, and the story continues, events took shape in a proposal of marriage, which she happily accepted. For my part of this tale, as small events evolved, I began to remember the dictates of my own pen, an insignificant relationship. This is what happened to me. I received an invitation from a friend offering me a vacation at her summer place in Vermont. I accepted and was not startled at first when I learned her summer place was in a city of Stowe. When I arrived, I found my hostess in such a highly nervous state, I realized I was faced with either a wretched summer or the choice of walking out on her. Never before in my life had I been strong enough to ignore that I thought were the claims of duty and friendship, but this time I did, and without ceremony returned to New York. A few days after I returned to my home, I too received a proposal of marriage. But at this point, fact and fiction parted. I refused the offer. I know, Neville, there is no such thing as fiction. Forgetful is green earth, and gods alone remember everlastingly. By their great memories the gods are known. Ends run true to their imaginal origin. We reap the fruit of forgotten blossom time. In life the events do not come up always where we have sown the seed, so that we may not recognize our own harvest. Events are the emergence of a hidden imaginal activity. Man is free to imagine whatever he desires. This is why, despite all fatalist and misguided prophets of doom, all awakened men know that they are free. They know that they are creating reality. Is there a scriptural passage to support this claim? Yes. And it came to pass, as he interpreted to us, so it was. W.P. Yeats must have discovered that there is no fiction, for after describing some of his experiences and the conscious use of imagination, he writes, "If all who have described events like this have not dreamed, we should rewrite our histories, for all men, certainly all imaginative men, must be forever casting forth enchantments, glamours, illusions in all men, especially tranquil men, who have so powerful egoistic life, must be continually passing under their power. Our most elaborate thoughts, elaborate purposes, precise emotions, are often, as I think, not really ours, but have on a sudden come up, as it were, out of hell or down out of heaven. There is no fiction. Imagine better than the best you know." End of chapter. Chapter 5. Subtle Threads. "All ye behold, though it appears without, it is within, in your imagination, of which this world of mortality is but a shadow." Blake. Nothing appears or continues in being by the power of its own. Events happen because comparatively stable imaginal activities created them, and they continue in being by virtue of the support they receive from such imaginal activities. The part which imagining the wish fulfilled plays in consciously creating circumstance is obvious in this series of stories. You will see how the telling of one story of the successful use of imagination can serve as a spur and a challenge to others to try it and see. One night a gentleman rose in my audience. He said that he had no question to ask, but would like to tell me something. This was his story. When he came out of the armed forces after World War II, he got a job that gave him take-home pay of $25 a week. After 10 years, he was making $600 a month. At that time, he bought my book, Awakened Imagination, and read the chapter, The Pruning Shears of Revision. Through the daily practice of revision, as set forth there, he was able to tell my audience 2 years later that his income was equal to that of the President of the United States. In my audience sat a man whom, by his confession, was broke. He had read the same book, but he suddenly realized he had done nothing with the use of his imagination to solve his financial problem. He decided he would try to imagine himself as the winner of the 510 pool at Caliente Racetrack. In his words, in this pool, one attempts to pick winners in the 5th through the 10th races. So this is what I did. In my imagination I stood, sorting my tickets, and feeling as I did so, that I had each of the 6 winners. I enacted this scene over and over in my imagination until I actually felt goose pimples. Then I saw the cashier give me a large sum of money, which I placed beneath my imaginary shirt. This was my entire imaginal drama, and for 3 weeks, night after night, I enacted this scene and fell asleep in the action. After 3 weeks, I traveled physically to the Caliente Racetrack, and on that day, every detail of my imaginative play was actually realized. The only change in the scene was that the cashier gave me a check for a total of $84,000 instead of currency. After my lecture the night this story was told, a man in the audience asked me if I thought it possible for him to duplicate TK's experience. I told him he must decide the circumstance of his imaginal scene himself, but that whatever scene he chose, he must create a drama that could make natural to himself and imagine the end intently with all the feelings he could muster. He must not labor for the means to the end, but live imaginatively in the feeling of the wish fulfilled. 1 month later, he showed me a check for $16,000, which he had won in another 510 pool at the same Caliente Racetrack the previous day. This man had a sequel to the most interesting duplication of TK's good fortune. His first win took care of his immediate financial difficulties, although he wanted more money for future family security. Also, and more important to him, he wanted to prove that this had not been an accident. He reasoned that if his good luck could happen a second time in succession, the so-called law of percentages would give way to proof for him that his imaginal structures were actually producing this miraculous reality, and so he dared to put his imagination to a second test. He continues, "I wanted a sizable bank account, and this to me meant seeing a large balance on my bank statement. Therefore, in my imagination, I enacted a scene which took me into 2 banks. In each bank I would see an appreciative smile meant for me from the bank manager as I walked into his establishment, and I would hear the teller's cordial greeting. I would ask to see my statement. In one bank I saw a balance of $10,000. In the other bank I saw a balance of $15,000. My imaginal scene did not end there. Immediately after seeing my bank balances, I would turn my attention to my horse racing system, which through a progression of 10 steps would bring my winnings to $11,533 with a starting capital of $200. I would divide the winnings into 12 piles on my desk. Counting the money in my imaginary hands, I would put $1,000 in each of 11 piles, and the remaining $533 in the last pile. My imaginative accounting would amount to $36,533, including my bank balances. I enacted this entire imaginative scene each morning, afternoon, and night for less than 1 month. And on March 2nd, I went to the Caliente track again. I made out my tickets, but strangely enough, and not knowing why I did so, I duplicated 6 more tickets exactly like the 6 already made. But in the 10th selection, I made a mistake and copied 2 tickets twice. As the winners came in, I held 2 of them, each paying $16,423.50. I also had 6 consolation tickets, each paying $656.80. The combined total amounted to $36,788. My imaginary accounting 1 month before had totaled $36,533. 2 points of interest most profound to me were that by seeming accidents I had marked 2 winning tickets identically, and also that at the end of the 9th race, which was one of the major winners, the trainer attempted to scratch the horse, but the stewards denied the trainer's request. How subtle were the threads that led to this goal. Results must testify to our imaginings, or we really are not imagining the end at all. Faithfully imagine the end, and all things conspired to aid his harvesting. His mistake in copying a winning ticket twice, and the steward's refusal to follow the trainee's request, were events created by the imaginal drama to move the plan of things forward to its goal. Chance, wrote Belfort Bax, may be defined as that element in the reality change, that is, in the flowing synthesis of events, which is irreducible to law or the causal category. To live wisely we must be aware of our imaginal activities, or at any rate, of the end of which they are tending. We must see to it that it is the end we desire. Wise imagining identifies itself only with such activities that are of value or promise well. However much man seems to be dealing with a material world, he is actually living in a world of imagination. When he discovers that it is not the physical world of facts, but imaginal activities which shapes his life, then the physical world will no longer be the reality, and the world of imagination no longer the dream. Does the road wind uphill all the way? Yes, to the very end. Will a day's journey take the whole long day? From morn to night, my friend. End of chapter. Chapter 6. Visionary Fancy. The nature of visionary fancy or imagination is very little known, and the external nature and permanence of its ever-existent images is considered as less permanent than the things of vegetative and generative nature. Yet the oak dies as well as the lettuce, but its eternal image and individuality never dies, but renews by its seed, just so the imaginative image returns by the seed of contemplative thought. Blake. The images of our imagination are the realities of which any physical manifestation is only the shadow. If we are faithful to vision, the image will create for itself the only physical manifestation of itself it has a right to make. We speak of the reality of a thing when we mean its material substance. That is exactly what imaginist means by its unreality or shadow. Imagining is spiritual sensation. Enter into the feeling of your wish fulfilled. Through spiritual sensation, through your use of imaginal sight, sound, scent, taste, and touch, you will give to your image the sensory vividness necessary to produce that image in your outer or shadow world. Here is a story of one who was faithful to his vision. F.B., being a true imaginist, remembered what he had heard in his imagination. Thus he writes, "A friend who knows my passionate fondness for opera tried to get Kirsten Flagstad's complete recording of Tristan and Isolde for me at Christmas. In over a dozen record stores she was told the same thing. RCA Victor is not reissuing this recording, and there have been no copies available since June 1st. On December 27th, I determined to prove your principle again by getting the album I desired so intensely. Laying down in my living room, I mentally walked into the record shop I patronize and asked the one salesman whose face and voice I could recall, "Do you have Flagstad's Complete as a Lud?" He replied, "Yes, I have." That ended the scene, and I repeated it until it was real to me. Late that afternoon, I went to that record shop to physically enact the scene. Not one detail supplied by the senses had encouraged me to believe I could walk out of the shop with those records. I had been told last September by the same salesman in the same shop the same story my friend had received there before Christmas. Approaching the salesman I had been in imagination that morning, I said, "Do you have Flagstad's Complete as a Lud?" He replied, "No, we haven't." Without saying anything audible to him, I said inwardly, "That's not what I heard you say." As I turned to leave the shop, I noticed on a top shelf what I thought to be an advertisement of this set of records and remarked to the salesman, "If you don't have the merchandise, you shouldn't advertise it." "That's right," he replied, and as he reached up to take it down, discovered it to be a complete album with all 5 records. The scene wasn't played exactly as I constructed it, but the results confirmed what my imagined scene implied. How can I thank you, F.B.? After reading F.B.'s letter, we must agree with Anthony Eden that an assumption, though false, if persisted in, will harden into fact. F.B.'s fancy, fusing with the sense feel of the record shop, enriched aspects of it and made them his, what he perceived. Our future is our imagining in its creative march. F.B. used his imagination for a conscious purpose, representing life as he desired it to be, and thereby affecting life instead of merely reflecting it. So sure was he that his imaginal drama was the reality and the physical act but a shadow. And when the salesman said, "No, we haven't," F.B. mentally said, "That's not what I heard you say." He not only remembered what he had heard, but he was still remembering it. Imagining the wish fulfilled is the seeking it finds, the asking that receives, the knocking to which is opened. He saw and heard what he desired to see and hear, and would not take "No, we haven't" for an answer. The imaginist dreams while awake. He is not the servant of his vision, but the master of the direction of his attention. Imaginative constancy controls perception of events in space-time. Unfortunately, most men are ever-changing like a joyless eye that finds no object worth its constancy. Mrs. G.R. too had imaginatively heard what she wanted to physically hear and knew the outer world must conform it. This is her story. Some time ago we advertised our home for sale, which was necessary for us to buy a larger property on which we had placed a deposit. Several people would have bought our home immediately, but we were obliged to explain that we could not close any deal until we learned whether or not our offer for the property we wanted had been accepted. At this time a broker called and literally begged us to allow him to show our home to a client of his, who was eager for this location, and would be glad to pay even more than we were asking. We explained our situation to the broker and to his client. They both stated they did not mind waiting for our deal to be consummated. The broker asked us to sign a paper, which he said was not binding in any way, but would give him first chance at the sale if our other deal went through. We signed the paper and later learned that in California real estate law, nothing could have been more binding. A few days later, our deal for the new property fell through, so we notified this broker, and his verbal response was, "Well, just forget it." 2 weeks later, he filed suit against us for $1,500 commission. Trial date was set, and we asked for a jury trial. Our attorney assured us that he would do all he could, but the law on this particular point was so stringent that he could not see any possibility of our winning the case. When time for the trial arrived, my husband was in the hospital and could not appear with me in our defense. I had no witnesses, but the broker brought 3 attorneys and a number of witnesses into court against us. Our attorney now told me we had not the slightest chance to win. I turned to my imagination, and this is what I did. Completely disregarding all that had been said by attorneys, witnesses, and judges who seemed to favor the plaintiff, I thought only of the words I wanted to hear. In my imagination I listened intently and heard the foreman of the jury say, "We find the defendant not guilty." I listened until I knew it was true. I closed my mind's ear to everything said in that courtroom and heard only those words. "We find the defendant not guilty." The jury deliberated from noon recess until 4:30 that afternoon, and all during those hours I sat in the courtroom and heard those words over and over in my imagination. When the jurors returned, the judge asked the foreman to stand and give their verdict. The foreman stood up and said, we find the defendant not guilty. Mrs. G.R. If there were dreams to sell, what would you buy? Would you not buy your wish fulfilled? Your dreams are without price and without money. By locking up the journey in her imagination, hearing only what she wanted to hear, she called the journey to unanimity on her behalf. Imagining being the reality of all that exists, with it the lady achieved her wish fulfilled. Hebel's statement that the poet creates from contemplation is true of imaginists as well. They know how to utilize their video-audio hallucination to create reality. Nothing is so fatal as conformity. We must not allow ourselves to be girt about by the ringed fixity of fact. Change the image and thereby change the fact. R.O. employed the art of seeing and feeling to create her vision and imagination. A year ago I took my children to Europe, leaving my furnished apartment in the care of my maid. When we returned a few months later to the United States, I found my maid and all my furniture gone. The apartment superintendent stated that the maid had my furniture moved by my request. There was nothing I could do at the moment, so I took my children and moved into a hotel. I, of course, reported the incident to the police and also brought in private detectives on the case. Both organizations investigated every moving company and every storage warehouse in New York City, but to no avail. There seemed to be absolutely no trace of my furniture nor of my maid. Having exhausted all outside services, I remembered your teaching and decided I would try using my imagination in this matter. So while seated in my hotel room, I closed my eyes and imagined myself in my own apartment sitting in my favorite chair and surrounded by all of my personal furnishing. I looked across the living room at the piano on which I kept pictures of my children. I would continue to stare at my piano until the entire room became vividly real to me. I could see my children's pictures and actually feel the upholstery of the chair, in which in my imagination I sat. The next day, as I came out of my bank, I turned to walk in the direction of my vacant apartment instead of toward my hotel. When I reached the corner, I discovered my mistake and was just about to turn back when my attention was drawn to a very familiar pair of ankles. Yes, the ankles belonged to my maid. I walked up to her and took hold of her arm. She was quite frightened, but I assured her all I wanted from her was my furniture. I called a taxi and she took me to the place in which her friends had stored my furnishing. In one day, my imagination had found what an entire big city police force and private investigators could not find in weeks. This lady knew of the secret of imagining before she called in the police, but imagining, in spite of its importance, was forgotten owing to attention being fixed on facts. However, what reasons failed to find by force, imagining found without effort. Nothing merely goes on, including the sense of loss, without its imaginal support. But imagining that she was seated in her own chair in her own living room, surrounded by her own furnishing, she withdrew the imaginal support she had given to her sense of loss, and by this imaginal change she recovered her lost furniture and reestablished her home. Your imagination is most creative when you imagine things as you desire them to be, building a new experience out of the dream of fancy. To build such a dream of fancy in her imagination, F.G. brought to play all of her senses: sight, sound, touch, smell, and even taste. This is her story. Since childhood, I have dreamed of visiting faraway places. The West Indies particularly fired my fancy, and I would revel in the feeling of actually being there. Dreams are wonderfully inexpensive, and as an adult I continue to dream my dreams, for I had no money or time to make them come true. Last year I was taken to the hospital in need of surgery. I had heard your teaching, and while recuperating had decided to intensify my favorite daydream while I had time on my hands. I actually wrote to the Alcoa steamship line asking for free travel folders and pored over them, hour after hour, choosing the ship and the stateroom and the 7 ports I desired most to see. I would close my eyes and in my imagination would walk up the gangplank of that ship and feel the movement of the water as the great liner pushed its way into the free ocean. I heard the thud of the waves breaking against the sides of the ship, felt the steaming warmth of the tropical sun on my face, and smelled and tasted salt in the air as we all sailed through blue waters. For 1 solid week, confined to a hospital bed, I lived the free and happy experience of actually being on that ship. Then the day before my release from the hospital, I tucked the colored folders away and forgot them. 2 months later, I received a telegram from an advertising agency telling me I had won a contest. I remembered having deposited a contest coupon some months ago before in a neighborhood supermarket, but had completely forgotten the act. I had won first prize, and wonder of wonders, it entitled me to a Caribbean cruise sponsored by the Alcoa Steamship Line. But the wonder didn't stop there. The very stateroom I had imaginedly lived in and moved about in while confined to the hospital bed had been assigned to me. And to make an unbelievable story even more unbelievable, I sailed on the one ship I had chosen, which stopped in not one, but all of the 7 ports I desired to visit. F.G. To travel is the privilege, not of the rich, but of the imaginative. End of chapter.